All right, what's going on, guys? And welcome to today's video where we are going to be talking about how to get stronger while losing fat. Now, this is something that a lot of people um, really struggle with. Whoops, we're going to go back a second. And that's why we're going to talk about this today. So, first off, let's connect. If you're not following me on YouTube, make sure you subscribe. If you're not following me on Instagram, if you're not following the podcast, make sure you check those ones out. All right. So let's just get right into it. Here's what we're going to be covering today. Essentially, we're going to talk about why people lose strength when dieting for fat loss. We're going to cover a lot of the intricacies involved. We're also going to talk about when you should and should not diet down. Okay, so there's definitely appropriate and inappropriate times, and we're going to cover all of the details around that. Then we're going to discuss how to structure fat loss phases for strength athletes. Because ultimately, everyone wants to be lean and jacked, but if you do cut and you do it incorrectly, you're going to lose strength. And so that's what we want to avoid here. So first of all, we need to understand why people lose strength during a diet. So specifically during a calorie deficit or a fat loss type of diet. So for starters, the first thing that happens is if you actually start losing weight, you're going to see a change in leverages often, okay? Typically, this is going to affect the bench press and the squat the most significantly. That's generally what most people will notice. If you pull sumo, you're probably not going to really notice a big difference. If you pull conventional and you're like a really big, or like a very high body fat lifter, you might actually even see a benefit to your deadlift because it's actually going to be easier to get into position sometimes. Now, for other people, it might actually hurt you because you have less pressure between your stomach and your knees, so that might negatively impact your deadlift. But again, these are just some of the changes that can happen when you see leverages change due to body weight reduction, specifically fat loss. Okay, so another reason a lot of people lose strength on a diet is they have an excessive caloric deficit. Okay, so excessive calorie restriction. So instead of being on a more appropriate calorie deficit, these individuals are on a 25-30% calorie deficit, where you're almost certainly going to be losing a significant amount of strength and recovery resources, okay? So we're going to talk a lot about how to balance all these things out a little bit later in the video. But right now, I really just want to emphasize and focus on why these things are such an issue. So again, if you don't have sufficient calories, not only are you going to have less energy to actually pull from in order to train and perform during your sessions, but you're also going to have less resources to pull from in order to recover and repair the tissues that have been damaged so that you can continuously do this thing over and over and over again, okay? Next is going to be insufficient protein intake. So maybe your calorie intake actually is decent. Maybe your rate of weight loss is actually pretty good, but you don't have enough protein in. And if you don't have enough protein in, you're going to be in a really tough spot because, again, proteins are required for recovery. Proteins are required for muscle mass. Proteins are required for a lot of metabolic functions, okay? And so if you have insufficient protein, you're just not doing yourself, you're basically not optimizing your possibility for recovery and performance, okay? And again, when you diet, you actually likely should increase your protein intake beyond what you've been doing previously, okay? Assuming that your, previous protein intake falls within a reasonable range, right? So, for instance, myself, I weigh 262 pounds as of this morning. I am currently in a dieting phase, and I'm still training for strength, and I'm actually getting stronger week by week. Now, my protein intake is 300 grams, even though I'm 260. So that is above the 1 gram per pound of body weight that most people say is kind of your max out. Personally, I will tell you from a lot of experience and a lot of bodybuilders and a lot of other kind of higher level coaches can concur that there's a lot of reasons to potentially utilize a high or even very high protein intake during a diet, okay? It's not necessarily going to lead to extra growth in muscle or anything like that, but there's a lot of additional reasons for why that might be the case. Okay, and I've talked about this a lot in other videos and other articles and things like that, so I'm not going to cover it too much here. I will touch on it a little bit more later on in the video when we do discuss protein intake, though. Okay, and the next one is insufficient recovery. So this is actually a very, very broad category. So recovery, essentially, when we look at this, we can think of it as allostatic load, the entire umbrella of stressors This could be emotional stress, psychological stress, physiological stress. Okay, how difficult is your work? Are you a laborer, or are you, a desk jockey, an engineer? Are you a personal trainer who's always on their feet and always on the go? Or are you like a stay-at-home mom or dad, right? These things all matter. Also, obviously, your sleep. Your diet is going to go into this. So there's so many different variables that are going to go into your recovery, right? Next is poor lifestyle habits, okay? Often become exposed when you're in a calorie deficit. Now, what I mean by that is maybe you're not getting the best sleep, but because you're eating so much and you have a very high body fat percentage, you have a lot of additional, energy to kind of pull from if you, miss a little bit of sleep at night or something like that, or maybe you chug a bunch of caffeine or something like that. So you can do things that probably aren't ideal and get away with it for a while, but when you go into a calorie deficit, your buffer for optimal shrinks quite a bit. Okay, so the things that you can actually do and get away with when you're in a calorie deficit goes down quite dramatically, or at least it can sometimes. So, for instance, if you're not getting enough protein intake and you start going into a calorie deficit, that's going to affect you a lot, and you're probably going to lose some muscle. If your diet is just really shitty and you go into a calorie deficit, your performance is probably going to drop off. If you're not getting enough sleep and you're just pounding back caffeine, when you go into a calorie deficit, your performance is probably going to drop off. And again, these things can also affect your body composition. So instead of losing, primarily fat mass, you might lose a lot more lean mass than you would otherwise have to lose, because you're just not organizing your approach correctly. So a lot of the times, a calorie deficit, especially for strength athletes, can really expose poor lifestyle habits. Okay, and again, these things are pretty, there's a pretty wide scope in terms of what these things might be. Right. Next, and this is a fucking huge one that I see all the time with powerlifting coaches and coaches in general. There is no alignment between the nutrition and the actual training program. So, for instance, you cannot handle the same volume in a calorie deficit, especially once you've lost a lot of body fat. You cannot handle the same volume and or intensity as you would if you were in a calorie deficit and had a bunch of additional energy. You just cannot. So if these things do not change, and if you program the same way for someone who's in a surplus and a maintenance and a calorie deficit, they're probably going to get fucked up. They're probably going to start overtraining or overreaching, or they're not going to be able to recover, so they're going to start missing their top sets, or they're not going to be able to maintain the type of volume that you need to get them stronger. So you need to be able to adjust your programming accordingly. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, and I'll give you specific recommendations a little bit later on in the video once we get to that section on how to structure your diet and your training for effective fat loss while still building strength. Okay. And the last thing, again, this is not a completely exhaustive list, but these are, by and large, if you do this, you're tackling 90 to 95% of the issues that most people run into when they're dieting. Okay. So is restricting calories for too long. So if you're dieting for 8 months, 9 months, 10 months, that's a very long time for no break. Okay. I have dieted people down for 8 months straight, and I will tell you this, very, very few people can do that effectively. Very few people can do that effectively without seeing significant drop-offs in strength, performance, even just psychological issues they might develop during dieting. So I generally do not recommend long dietary periods unless the individual is very disciplined, very skilled, and doesn't have any major risk factors or contraindications for doing something like that. Okay, so that is one thing that I would definitely say is a cautionary tale: is you do not want to diet for too long, generally speaking. I would typically suggest diets do not go longer than like maybe 12 weeks at a time, and you adopt more of a phasic approach. But again, we're going to talk about that in a moment. Okay, so before we get into the how-tos, I want to discuss a little bit about when to cut and when not to cut. All right. So generally, you want to avoid cutting during competition prep. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this. I have dieted down several athletes into a competition, but there are a lot of variables that go into this, and if you do not know what you're doing, it's very, very easy to fuck things up. It's easy to do it correctly, but it's very easy to fuck it up. And so a great example of this is I used to be a chef. Creme brulees, Yorkshire pudding, mousse, things like that to make these things. It's actually pretty easy, right? If you follow the steps, you're going to have a great product by the end of it. But it's also very easy to fuck up. So if you miss a step or if you fuck something up somewhere in that process, you're going to get a fucked up dessert, okay? So it's the exact same way when it comes to program design and dieting. You need to make sure that the broader approach that you're taking is effective and it takes in all of the different factors of a competition cycle. Because you can get away with dieting when you're 16, 12 weeks out, not a problem. And you can probably shed a decent amount of weight and not really see any big performance drop off. You can probably, if you're doing it correctly, again, you can probably see some pretty significant performance enhancements as well, right? But the closer you start getting to your peak and your actual competition, you really won't have a whole lot to play with, right? Because you're already cutting out volume so that you can just recover and not completely blow up, right? And again, the stronger you are, the more this is going to be an issue. If you're a novice or if you're kind of, early intermediate or mid-range intermediate, it's not going to be as problematic in a lot of cases, but especially the higher level athlete you are, and I do coach a handful of pretty damn high level elite and international elite athletes, it does become problematic for them because if this is kind of what their absolute max is, this is kind of where they have to be at that tail end of the peak, right? So you want to make sure that you're pushing them, but you also want to make sure you don't fucking kill them or blow them up. And so that's a very fine line to walk. So you don't really want to be dieting people down at that last little bit. If they need to do weight cuts, that's a little bit different. That's a water cut. But then you have to manage sodium intake and you have to manage fluids. And there's a lot of things that can go wrong there as well, especially if you're doing a very dramatic water cut. So we're not really going to get into that stuff here. We're particularly talking about fat loss, not weight loss. Those things are similar, but they are not the same, okay? So if you are going to cut during prep, you need to do it gradually, and you want to emphasize most of the weight loss at the beginning of your cycle. You don't want to be doing a ton of weight loss and cutting calories and restricting a bunch of stuff, especially at the tail end when you're peaking. That's when you need to really maximize every single resource and pull all of the levers so you can really get the most out of your peak, and you can make sure that that athlete is going to go in with as little injuries as possible, because a lot of the times people do go in pretty banged up. Most people, especially if you're competing at a high level, usually have an injury or something nagging when they're competing at these competitions. So you want to make sure they're going in as healthy as possible and as recovered as possible. And they're just certainly not going to be doing that if they're in a really significant calorie deficit and if they've been in a calorie deficit for a long time, okay? So you want to make sure you're doing this intelligently, probably diet for the first, let's say, 4 to 6 weeks, and then the remaining 8 weeks or whatever it is that you're doing, just keep them on maintenance for a little bit, okay? If you have to do that, all right? That's not ideal, but sometimes you have to make the best out of a bad situation, all right? Now, off-season dieting. So there's pros and cons to this, right? Depending on who you are, depending on your frame, depending on what weight class you should be in and which weight class you are in, this is going to really influence the decisions that you make in terms of dieting. Now, a lot of the times, the athletes that I'm working with, I am really emphasizing their body composition. If they're an elite athlete, if they're a beginner athlete, whatever it is, we are emphasizing their body composition, because the more muscle that you have at a given weight class, the higher probability you have of winning. This has been shown in research, and it's also just fucking common sense, to be honest. If you are up against a bunch of jacked dudes, typically the most jacked dude is the strongest. Okay, that's what you see at powerlifting competitions. Everyone's strong, but the guy who's got the most amount of muscle in that weight class generally is the strongest. Okay, and again, nothing should really be too surprising about that. That's typically what you see across the board in all weight classes. All right, so you want to make sure that you're maximizing your amount of muscle mass, which makes off-season a great time for hypertrophy and for bulking. Okay, but if you are thinking long-term and you're like, you know what, I'm in the 308 class, but I probably belong in the 275 class. Or, if you're in a lighter weight class, but you still have a higher body fat percentage, you could really benefit from getting very lean and then maybe climbing back up. Then these things are really going to determine what you should be doing. Because, sometimes when you're looking at your competitive seasons, it's not just a matter of what can I do this year. you really need to think, like, if you want to really hit your potential, you need to have about a 3 to 5 year plan, right? So for instance, I'll show you this with one of my athletes at the end, where we show you a little bit of a case study. But one of my athletes is a strongman, competitive strongman, and he wants to really maximize his potential. But he was too fat initially, had too much body fat, but he was also too small. Okay, so this is kind of a a tough space to be in, because you want him to be bigger, but you don't want him to just be a fat blob. You want him to still be athletic. You want him to maximize his potential, and he's a natural athlete too. So it's not like we can do a lot of recomp and stuff like that just by manipulating drugs and whatever. So we need to be very intentional about how we're dieting this individual down. So for those people who are, bigger, have a lot of body fat to lose, but still probably want to maintain or compete at that same weight class or even go up, they will need to think a lot longer. It's not 6 months or a year, it's several years to really pull them back to the level of leanness and then go through those bulking and cutting cycles till eventually they're at the ideal, body weight and body composition. It's going to maximize their performance and potential. Okay. And that's something really difficult for people to kind of, not to understand, but to accept. Okay. Because no one wants to hear, yes, we can do that, but it's going to take you 3 to 5 years. But that's the reality of what this is, right? This is not a 6-month fix for a lot of people. For a lot of people, you got to look at least 3 to 5 years, So let's talk a little bit about what you should be doing if you want to lose fat and you're a strength athlete, okay? Now, here's the thing. A lot of people say you can't gain strength and lose fat at the same time, and that's complete fucking bullshit. Virtually every athlete I work with who is a strength athlete, the number one priority, unless they have some really big competition or something like that coming up, the number one priority is we need to fucking fix your body composition. We need to get you lean and we need to get you healthy. Because I know that the leaner you are, the better you're going to perform. Obviously, that's to a point. If you're 5% body fat, that's really going to fuck with your performance. But if we get you somewhere between the 10 to 12 to even 15% body fat range, you're still going to have abs and you're going to be quite lean, and you're really going to maximize your muscular potential for your weight class. It's also going to help you enhance your athleticism, enhance your recovery. If you're a super heavyweight or something like that, that's going to keep you as healthy as you possibly can be, because having high body fats when you're that big can be very, very difficult on your quality of life and so on and so forth. So this is very, very important. And I do this with every single one of my athletes. A lot of my athletes, like I'd say probably about 50% have a 6-pack, okay? Or if they don't have a 6-pack yet, they're on their way to a 6-pack, because it's just so freaking important in my mind to be lean and to look the part as well. Not just for aesthetics, but because it 100% does relate to your actual athletic performance, all right? So where I like to start a lot of my athletes, and there is no, there's a handful of right ways to do things. I'm just basically telling you the way that I like to do things, and I'm explaining my thought process around this. So I like to start with a maintenance phase. If they're not super, super experienced dieters, or even if they are really experienced dieters, but they haven't been dieting for a period, I like to start with a maintenance phase. And the reason why is because if you haven't been dieting for a long time, it's going to take you a while to really start to build up that level of adherence and build up the skills and things like that to really start nailing it. If you're doing that while we're cutting, you're probably going to fuck yourself over. You're going to eat way too little one day, then overeat the next day. Your protein intake might be too low one day, but might be too high the next. You know what I mean? Like, you're just going to be all over the place, and the likelihood that you're going to lose, it's going to affect your performance negatively goes up a little bit. Okay, probably not super dramatically, but it definitely does go up a bit, because I have seen this enough in my coaching experience to know that that's something that can happen. So I like to have a little bit more of a buffer. And that buffer is I keep them in maintenance. So we start dieting, but I keep them in maintenance. And that allows them to fuck up and make all those mistakes and kind of trip until they can kind of eventually, build that momentum. Once they built the momentum, then we start putting them into a diet, because now they're already on point. Okay, they've reached that level of adherence that allows us to now move forward with a high degree of certainty that they're going to execute and they're going to maintain all of their performance and their progress and everything they've built up until this point while they're dieting, okay? But we need to have a certain baseline level of adherence and skills developed prior to going into the calorie deficit. Some people don't like this. Some people become impatient. They just want to get into the diet right away. I'm generally, I'm against that. Unless someone can really demonstrate that they can fucking handle it, I'm generally against that. I would rather put them into maintenance. And if they can do it for a week, show me you can do it for a week. If you can, fantastic. Let's go right into that diet. We don't need to build you out into that maintenance phase. But if you're doing it for a week and I look at your diet and I look at your check-in and everything's all fucked up from one day to the next, no, we're going to keep you in there until you can show me that you can manage diet successfully. Because that's ultimately what's going to allow you to continue to increase your strength and your performance while simultaneously losing body fat and retaining all of the muscle, potentially even building a little bit more during the process, okay? Then we want to think about adopting a gradual rate of fat loss, okay? Now, this is contingent on performance. So, for instance, if I have someone who's really, really fat, I might get them to lose 3-5 pounds even a week sometimes for the first couple of weeks. And I might not be too concerned about that at all because they just have so much fat to lose that it's just not a big deal. Whereas, for someone who's maybe a little bit leaner, if they're losing 5 pounds a week, I'd be really concerned and we'd really need to slam the brakes on and slow things down, okay? So, it's not always as simple as saying lose a pound a week or lose half a pound a week. Even percentages sometimes, because sometimes percentages are still too slow or too fast for some people. It's really going to depend on their response to training. Are they still able to make progress? And if they're still able to see progress, then that's fantastic. So for instance, myself, I started dieting, and this was maybe three or 4 weeks ago, right? And the first 3 weeks, again, were a maintenance phase. Okay, they're a maintenance phase because for myself, I notice it takes me a while to build up that adherence again. If I'm not dieting, I need to get really, really strict with it again. Okay, and then once I've reached that point, it took me about 3 weeks. My 4th week, I officially started my diet. I gave myself about a 15% calorie deficit. And so far, just this 1 week, it's only Thursday when I'm recording this. So I started on Monday and it's only Thursday. I'm down about 4.5 pounds. This is not an issue at all. Okay, this is not an issue for several reasons. One, there's going to be less food content in my stomach. Okay, I'm probably going to retain slightly less water because my carbohydrates have gone down. Okay, so a larger rate of weight loss is not necessarily problematic in the first 1 or 2 weeks. Okay, it's kind of to be expected. And again, that's going to be variable depending on the size of the athlete, their experience, what their diet composition actually looks like, what their, how much body fat they've had and what their adherence looks like and all sorts of different things. Okay, but for me, that's not problematic. Next week, I would actually probably expect to lose about 3 pounds. Again, still not problematic. After about week 3 or 4, I want that rate to be about 1 pound to 1.5 pounds. Now, how am I coming up with these numbers? Well, that's because I know myself and I know that that is the good rate that is going to allow me to see the fastest and the most progress while still allowing me to make progress in my strength as well. So this week, again, I increased weight on all of my lifts from the previous week. Even though I'm in a calorie deficit now, I still increased my performance, okay? And again, that's because, my training and my diet and how I'm dieting, it all lines up, all right? So this is very important. You want to make sure that you have a gradual rate of progress. Generally speaking, for strength athletes, you want to be going 0.25 to 0.5% of your body weight lost per week. If you have a lot more fat, you can lose at a slightly faster rate. Okay, but generally speaking, 0.25 to 0.5%. And the reason why I use percentage is because that's going to scale a little bit more effectively to individuals. 1 pound of weight loss per week for 100-pound a woman is a lot a lot different than like a one pound of weight loss per week for a 300-pound guy, right? So instead of using pounds, I sometimes like to use percentages because it's a little bit more effective and scales to individuals a little bit better, generally. Okay. Next, we want to emphasize other variables to account for the deficit. So initially, we talked about how bad lifestyle behaviors and habits can be exposed during a calorie deficit. So this is what we really want to emphasize during that initial maintenance phase. We want to say, okay, what does your sleep look like? What does your stress management look like? What does your hydration look like? So this is really important. A 1% reduction in hydration status can result in up to a 10% reduction in strength performance. 2 to 4% reduction in hydration status can result in up to a 25 to 30% drop off in work capacity. That's fucking huge. 25 to 30%. So if your hydration's not on point and you're in a calorie deficit, you're shooting yourself in the head. You're just not going to be making the kind of strength gains you want. Unless you're a genetic freak, and hey, lucky for you, but that's not going to last forever, right? We want to give you the best possible opportunity to make the most amount of strength progress while dieting and getting leaner. So this is the things that we have to manage. Okay, so we're looking at sleep. We're looking at sleep quality, duration, and whether it matches up with your normal biological circadian rhythm. So for instance, if you're getting 8 hours of sleep, you're going to bed at 5 in the morning and getting up at, whatever time that is, it's just not going to be very good quality sleep for the most part, right? We want you to make sure that you're getting good quality sleep. We can look at recovery modalities like, hot and cold, walking, cardiovascular training, recovery-based workouts, having a higher protein intake diet. We can look at biasing carbohydrates over fat because that's a little bit more performance enhancing and restorative and anabolic in general. So, anabolic, but if you're in a calorie deficit, it's kind of going to be like anti-catabolic, I guess you could say. Okay, so there's a lot of different opportunities that we have here and a lot of different levers that we can pull to really make sure that we're emphasizing the lifestyle variables that are going to ensure that you can get the most out of your training, okay, the most out of the least, all right? Then, again, we want to think about dieting in phases. So probably not the best idea to diet someone down for 8 or 9 months straight. I've done that with athletes. I've done that myself. But it's very rare that I will do that with anyone. Only a very, very small percentage of individuals can do that and actually have it be more effective than utilizing alternate approaches. So it's not very common to see that. Even though I have done it before, most people are not going to benefit off of that, okay? Only a very, very small select few of individuals who are very disciplined and very, very structured in their diet, okay? Then we need to look at adjusting programming metrics. So fatigue management and MED, so minimum effective dose. Sometimes people call it minimum effective volume. The reason why I say dose is because we're not just looking at volume here, we're also looking at intensification metrics. So for instance, if you're programming for strength and someone's in calorie surplus, maybe they can handle 5 sets of triples at a straight weight. If you're in a calorie deficit, that's a lot of fucking volume. Like if you're doing squats, now not for everyone, but for me, that's definitely a lot. Like 5 sets of triples at straight weight, if I'm in a deficit, that's going to crush me. It just will crush me. So maybe you don't need to do 5 sets. Maybe you only need to do 3 sets. And maybe you only need to do 1 top set instead of doing straight sets, right? So we're still getting a good neurological stimulus, but we're not getting as much fatigue generated because we're doing less of the primary barbell work and we're emphasizing hypertrophy and maybe weak points and other things like that over some of those primary movements that are a little bit more fatiguing. So we really, really need to consider exercise selection and then also volume load management. So where are we structuring our volume? For instance, let's say, we need 7 sets of legs of leg training every week to progress. So for instance, that's me. I generally will have about 7 to 10 sets combined between deadlift and squat. And if I do that, I am progressing. I'm making progress. I'm getting stronger. I'm getting bigger. I am someone who responds very, very well to lower volume and a little bit higher intensity. Okay. So if you were to give me more volume, it's going to blow me up. All right. Now, maybe if I'm in a calorie surplus, I can do, 3 straight sets. Okay. So let's say we're doing, 3 sets of 4 on the squat. Maybe I can do, I don't know, like 540, 550, something like that. Okay. And I'm doing something like that. Let's say it's like an RP 7 or 8. Okay. So that's what I can do if I'm in a calorie surplus or even in a maintenance. And that's not a big deal. But if I'm in a calorie deficit, that's going to blow me up. 1 week and I'm going to be done. I'm not going to be able to repeat or progress anything next week. I just know that. All right. So instead, what I might do is I might utilize something called ascending sets. Okay. So I might do 1 set, raise the weight, do another set, raise the weight, and then do my top set. So now I'm working up to my top set, but I'm doing 4 reps or whatever the rep prescription is for all of those sets that I'm working up. So I'm accumulating volume as I'm going up, but it's not at such a high intensity. It's really going to cause a ton of systemic fatigue. So I'm only doing 1 top set, and technically I'm doing 2 back off sets. but I'm working up to doing my top set so that once I do it, I'm done. I can walk away. I can do my other stuff, right? Then maybe I fill the blanks or fill the gaps with, let's say, some hack squats. So I really like hack squats, so I love doing that. Again, probably like one set to failure, and then one set, maybe like a 2 or 3 RIR, and then that's going to be it for me for that day for the lower body stuff. Then I'm going to my back training. I may be doing some bicep stuff, a lot of hamstring curls and GHR, things like that. But that's it for me. So it's mostly it's accessory work. All right, it's supplementary work and it's accessory work. All right, so you can kind of shift where you're prioritizing your volume based on the recovery resources you have available. So generally, if you are doing a really strength-based program, you're going to focus on minimum effective volume, minimum effective dose of intensity, okay? And you're really going to be pushing the fuck out of your accessories and your ancillary exercises. Those are the ones you really, really want to push super hard on. And on your primaries, you just want to think about maybe chipping. Just every week, you're trying to chip just a little bit higher. And let's say you even have a rep range. So this is a very simplistic approach. I use it all the time with certain athletes, especially kind of intermediate athletes. I use it a lot because it's just very effective kind of linear progression. Let's say I have you doing, 3 sets of 8 to 12, okay, on the bench press or something like that, just hypothetically. Or probably more accurate, let's say like 3 to 5 reps, okay? So you've got a range, 3 to 5 reps. So 3, 4, 5. If you hit anywhere in there, you're good to go. So let's say on day 1, you hit your top set and you do 5 reps. And then you do 5 reps on the second one and 5 reps on the third one, on the third set. Okay, great. Next week, you know to go up. So next week, you go up a little bit. And then maybe you get 4, 3, 3 for your sets. Okay, repeat that weight again next time. Then you get 5, 5, 4. Okay, now you've gotten almost all of your sets at 5. Time to go up and weight again. You go up and weight again, and maybe you can only do 3, 3, 3. Great. You repeat the weight until you can do all 3 sets at 5 reps. Then you increase the weight and drop the reps down. And then you just repeat that process, okay? Very, very easy process to utilize. You can use ascending sets. You can use a top set, back off set. So, work up and do singles until you get up to your top set. Hit your top set for the prescribed number of reps. Then do maybe 10 to 15 to 20%, reduction. And then, a couple more back off sets at that weight. A couple more back off sets. And then you move on to something else, right? So it doesn't need to be anything super, super crazy. But you basically don't want to have as much volume on the main lifts because it's going to be a little bit too systemically fatiguing. So you want to really, really think about pushing hard as fuck in your accessories and your assistance movements. That's going to be your bread and butter, okay, when you're in a calorie deficit. So that's a little bit of kind of a background in terms of how you might want to think about adjusting your program for that. Now, when strength progression slows down, okay, this is really important because can you gain strength when losing fat? 150%. You can absolutely make fantastic strength progress when you're losing fat. But the question is, how much fat are you actually losing? Okay? If you're losing 10 or 15 pounds, absolutely. Shouldn't really be an issue. If you do this intelligently, you shouldn't really lose any strength and you should actually gain some decent strength during that process. If you're losing like 20, 30, 40 pounds, and again, this is also going to be relative to your size as an individual. If we're talking about a 60-kilo woman losing 20 pounds, yeah, she's definitely going to be losing a lot of strength, right? But if we're talking about a 300-pound dude losing 15 pounds, not really going to be a huge deal. Once we get into 30, 40, 50 pounds, yeah, okay, now we're looking at potentially losing some significant strength, right? If you do things incorrectly. So eventually, let's say you have a large amount of weight to lose, like, let's say above 30 pounds, okay? If you're losing more than 30 pounds, progress will probably slow down, okay? And you probably won't be seeing progress in your strength anymore. But we can still maintain the strength that you have achieved. Because again, if you're maintaining your strength, but you're 30 pounds less, guess what? You're actually stronger. You're stronger than you used to be, okay? So that's really important to remember. So when your progress slows and you need to kind of pivot and find a way to still make progress, you want to think about attacking your weak points. So for instance, in the bench press, let's say, you get pinned right off the chest. Okay, your pecs are probably a little too weak. So maybe you want to start emphasizing, a little bit more chest hypertrophy. You want to switch a little bit more to hypertrophy, or you might call it like a power building type program, or even kind of one of the things that I was outlining previously, where you're having a little bit of intensity and then the rest is just kind of a little bit more bodybuilding, a little bit more assistance and isolation type movements. So it's not quite as fatiguing. Doing those things can be really, really effective, okay, when strength progression starts to actually slow down. So there's a lot of different things you can pull. You can think about increasing the duration of your sleep. You can look at recovery aids. So again, like using sauna, using cold therapy, all sorts of different things, right? And it's like, is it going to blunt, is using cold therapy potentially going to blunt some of the adaptations you're going to see? Yes, it could. But if it allows you to recover enough to continue pushing, then that's a net positive, right? So again, you kind of have to weigh these things against what results your clients or your athletes are actually seeing, or if this is you, what results you're actually seeing, okay? So it's not always as cut and dry as like, don't use, cold therapy when you're training because it's going to blunt the hypertrophic response and strength and blah, blah, blah. It's not always that simple. Most of the time it's fairly simple, but when you start really, really honing in those little details, every little bit can make a pretty big difference, right? And if we can find 1% here and 1% there and 1% there, well, now all of a sudden, now we're talking about 5%. And a 5% improvement in your performance is pretty damn huge, right? So these details, they shouldn't be focused on until you've got the basics down. But once you've got the basics fucking nailed, you absolutely want to be tapping into them, all right? So here's a quick case study that I wanted to touch on. So this is one of my athletes. He's a competitive strongman. And he lost, I actually think it's more than 35 pounds. I'm pretty sure I actually ended up losing 40 something. I think it was 42 pounds, not 35 pounds. But when I wrote this, it was 35. So we'll just stick with that. Okay, so he lost 35 pounds, and he's sitting at roughly 10% over here. Okay, now whether he's 10%, 12%, 9%, I don't fucking care, right? The measurement that he got said he was about 10%. Okay, and so for me right now, I'm good enough with that. So he lost quite a bit of body fat, as you can see, and he was able to retain all of his strength. Now his recovery, he really struggled in the end in his recovery, but he was still maintaining what he was doing before. Now the program we adjusted so that he was not doing as much volume and he wasn't doing as much intensity work because he was calorically restricted. We emphasized a lot of high energy flex approaches. So utilizing like high step counts. He's also very active for his work, so that really helped out as well. We focused on nutrient timing to really, really pile in calories around his workout to make the most out of his sort of quote unquote anabolic window and to enhance his recovery and things like that. We did things with the times that he was training to make sure that he wasn't training too close to bed or too far away from bed so that he'd be fatigued and he'd be tired, so sleep pressure could kick in and he'd really have a good night's sleep. His sleep was on point. He was getting 8, 9, 10 hours of sleep sometimes. His hydration was like 4 to 5 liters a day on average. He was really consistent with everything. Like, this dude crushes it. Very, very disciplined, very detail-oriented, very dedicated athlete, okay? He ended up competing in, I think in like a state championships or something like that. And I think he won it the previous year. And then I think this year he got second, but he was like 40 pounds lighter. And he had PR'd a bunch of things that he hadn't done as well in last time. And he's already very light. Like, so I believe on the right, he was weighing about 190 pounds or 194 pounds or something like that. So we're talking really light for a strong man. All the people he's up against are like 250, and he's 190 pounds, and he still got second, right? So that was a pretty big deal, knowing that, okay, he didn't come in first, but he PR'd several things that he had done not as good in the previous year, and he came in second, but he was like 40 pounds lighter. So very clearly, he is stronger than he was before, okay? And so he was able to smash his competition targets. We shifted him into a maintenance phase, and he did that for about 4 or 5 weeks. And then now, currently, he's actually in a bulking phase, okay? And so I think he's up about 8 or something pounds right now. But he's doing very well. He's retaining his muscle mass very, very well. He's maintaining his physique very well. And we're basically just going to continue doing this process until eventually he gets back up to about 225, 230, but he maintains his current physique right here, okay? So again, like I said, his dieting took him about 7 months to get down about 40 pounds, okay? But like I said, he was getting stronger, and then during the tail end, he wasn't getting stronger, but he was maintaining his strength very well while down 35, 40, 42, whatever pounds, okay? So it's a pretty big deal. So, again, this is not a short-term thing. If you want to just kind of rush into this and cut a bunch of weight, this is not bodybuilding. If you want to retain your physique, you have to do things intelligently. And this is one of those guys who is able to diet for a very long period of time and stay very disciplined and dedicated the entire time. I would not do this for very many people, but because he demonstrated his ability to do it and his performance didn't really suffer, that's why we did it, okay? So again, I hope that helped. If you have any additional questions, Instagram is the best place to reach me. Please make sure you subscribe to the podcast, to the YouTube channel, and all that other good shit. I'm terrible at marketing, so just do it. Don't really know what else to say. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope that was helpful, and I hope now you have a much more in-depth understanding of the variables that are very, very important when dieting for fat loss while still gaining strength. Thanks so much, and I'll see you guys on the next video.